This is Lecture 5 in the series Introduction to Pro-Capitalist Macroeconomics.
I want to begin by answering a couple of questions I've received from some astute students of economics, which will serve also as a review of much of yesterday's lecture. One question I was asked was, how would I answer the objection that real wages are determined by the productivity of labor only under conditions of full employment? The implication being, if we don't have full employment, well, what determines real wages? Well, let me point out that the existence of full employment is not essential to the operation of the principle that real wages are determined by productivity. Full employment is relevant to the equilibrium of money wages. Nominal wages, money wages, under freedom of competition, go to the point corresponding to full employment. When there is unemployment, money wages will fall, expanding the quantity of labor demanded. If money wages fall lower than corresponds to full employment, there will be a labor shortage and money wages will rise. But let us suppose that labor unions or minimum wage legislation prevents the existence of full employment. Let us assume that we have some chronic unemployment rate. Let us imagine year in and year out, roughly 10% of the people able and willing to work are unemployed. Well, if we were to have that amount of unemployment, but we still had a definite number of people who were employed, let us suppose we have 100 people in a society able and willing to work. 10 of them are prevented from working by labor unions and minimum wage legislation, but 90 are working. Now, if over a period of years these 90 are able to produce twice as much per worker, then the total supply of goods doubles. If the total spending in this economy, both to pay wages and to buy the goods, stays the same, well, what happens to wages? What happens to prices? Wages stay the same, prices fall. The same spending to buy goods would buy double the goods at half the prices. The same spending to pay labor would employ the same limited labor force. But what would be the relationship between wages and prices? What would be governing the change in that relationship? The productivity of labor. Now, we could then go through the whole discussion of part of last time and ask, well, what happens if at the same time the quantity of money increases or more people are working? But the principle will remain. I just wish to make the point that the existence of unemployment does not in any way change the essential principle that real wages are determined by the productivity of labor. All right, now I had a further question which I'd like to try to answer, which ties into the last portion of yesterday's discussion and will set the stage for the discussion of today. And this was in connection with what I referred to as the economic degree of capitalism. Point F on page 16 says that real wages depend on the economic degree of capitalism. And I basically gave you just a numerical example. Now I can go into that more deeply. And interestingly enough, I can explain the idea in terms of one of the concepts that Professor Walsh brought out in his discussion of Marx. If you remember, Marx described capitalistic production as beginning with the outlay of money for the purpose of producing commodities which were to be sold for a larger sum of money. And Marx refers to this as capitalistic circulation, in contrast to what he calls simple circulation of workers producing commodities, selling them for money, and then turning around and buying other commodities. All right, now, I think that this is really not bad as a description of capitalistic circulation. I'm willing to accept this. And when I use the term productive expenditure is the money spent for the purpose of bringing in the larger sum of money. This represents productive expenditure. This is money that businessmen spend to pay wages, to buy materials, to buy machinery, to purchase goods at wholesale. Anything that business firms buy for business purposes is productive expenditure, and we can subsume it under this M. And this M prime is their sales revenues. And hopefully the sales revenues will exceed the productive expenditures. All right, well, how could we express the idea of the economic degree of capitalism? Well, the higher is M relative to M prime, the greater is the economic degree of capitalism. In this situation, there is zero economic degree of capitalism. Over here, we could say there is another M which equals 0. We could say that everything fits the sequence MC M prime, but in pre-capitalist circulation, that first M has a value of 0. So that's 0 economic degree of capitalism. Capitalistic production does begin with an outlay of money for the purpose of producing things for sale at a profit. That's the essence of capitalistic production, the spending of money to buy means of production, to produce a product to be sold for a larger sum of money. And an economic system, from an economic point of view, is to be described as more capitalistic in degree that the spending for the purpose of bringing in money is higher relative to the money being brought in. So the higher is the ratio of M to M prime, the higher is the economic degree of capitalism. Now, we can give some more concrete illustration of the idea and then elaborate on its significance for the determination of real wages, if you'll be so kind as to turn to page 23 in the lecture supplement, table 7. Page 23, table 7. Now we have two columns. You can ignore the heading of this table, and we'll just look at the columns. The left-hand column I describe as spending for factors of production by business, productive expenditure. Well, you could simply substitute M for that. The first M in this sequence can label the left-hand column. That's M. Then we have receipts from the sale of the products of business. Well, that's M prime. All right, now we want to see how a rise in the economic degree of capitalism operates to both raise the wage share of consumption and the productivity of labor. We're going to try to relate this table 7 to what I have on the board. What I have on the board is equation 6 back on page 16. That's really where we ended right before I started getting into this discussion. I have equation 6. The average real wage I algebraically derived is equal to demand for labor over demand for consumers' goods, the spending to pay wages over the spending to buy consumers' goods, times the supply of consumer goods over the supply of labor. This last expression reflects the productivity of labor. The more productive labor is, the greater will be the supply of consumer goods being produced relative to the supply of labor. The lower will be prices relative to wages. This expression, which I label the distribution factor, this reflects wages relative to consumption. Okay, now, table 7 allows us to gain some further insight into the significance of these terms. I have numbers in table 7, and I'm imagining that the spending to buy capital goods, the spending to buy machinery, materials, goods at wholesale, anything that businesses buy from other businesses, that spending I'm imagining is 300. $300 billion, if you like. Now, whatever business firms buy in the way of materials, machinery, or anything else from other business firms is simultaneously the sales revenues of business firms. Whatever General Motors buys in the way of steel sheet is a sales revenue to U.S. Steel or whomever. In addition, business firms make wage payments. Well, what do the workers do with the wages they receive? They spend them in buying goods from business. For the sake of simplicity, we're assuming that they consume those wages. Well, now over on the right, I have receipts from the sale of consumers' goods to wage earners, 500. Then there's a further source of sales revenues, which is the consumption expenditure of the sellers of products, the owners of business themselves. What is paid out in dividends, what partners and proprietors take, interest payments. That is a further source of receipts from the sale of consumer goods. Now, a rise in the economic degree of capitalism would come about if, for example, the sellers of products, the owners of business, were to reduce their personal consumption expenditure from 200 to 100. Imagine that there's item 3 over on the lower right in the second column in table 7. Suppose that number, instead of being 200, fell to 100. Businessmen decide, well, let's cut down world trips. Let's not buy that larger yacht or fancier car. Let's put the money back into the business. And this is an economy-wide phenomenon. Well, let us imagine that corresponding to the 100 reduced personal consumption of businessmen, there were 50 more of wage payments and 50 more of spending to buy capital goods. So we would add 50 to spending to buy capital goods. Spending to buy capital goods would now be 350. Wage payments would now be 550. And we'd have to do that on both sides. Receipts from the sale of capital goods would be 350 instead of 300. Receipts from the sale of consumer goods to wage earners would be 550 instead of 500. All right, well now simply look at this example and ask what has happened to the ratio of wages to consumer spending. Wages initially were 500, and what was consumer spending initially? Initially, consumer spending was 700. Now, if we put those numbers over here, our demand for labor initially was 500. Our demand for consumer goods initially was 700. All right, well now, the demand for labor is 550. The demand for consumer goods will only be 600. So what has happened to this distribution factor as the result of the rise in the economic degree of capitalism? How did I get 600? Okay, because I'm assuming that the personal consumption expenditure of the capitalists falls from 200 to 100, 50 of which they expend in wage payments, 50 of which they expend in buying additional capital goods. Pardon me? Does it come to 650? All right, then I'm mistaken. Thank you. You're right. The consumption of the capitalists is 100. The consumption of the wage earners is 550. So total consumption is 650 instead of 600. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Okay. Wages are 550. Consumption spending is 650. Consumption spending used to be 700, now it's 650. Where has that 50 gone? To capital goods. Okay. Real wages reflect the product of this distribution factor times the productivity of labor. Now we see that as the economic degree of capitalism rises, one thing that's happened is this distribution factor has improved in favor of the wage earners. If businessmen, if those who are selling products use a greater portion of their sales revenues to plow back into their businesses, the demand for labor will be that much higher. The consumption expenditure of those who sell the products is lower, the demand for labor is higher, the consumption of those who are paid wages will be greater. So wages will have a higher ratio to consumption. That's the distribution factor. But now what has happened to the relative spending between capital goods and consumer goods? It used to be there was $700 being spent for consumer goods, $300 for capital goods. What's happened now? How much is being spent for consumer goods? How much for capital goods? $650 for consumer goods, $350 for capital goods. The spending for capital goods has risen relative to the spending for consumer goods. Well, the change in that relationship underlies a progressive rise in the productivity of labor. It's not sufficient by itself, but it's necessary and very important in the following way. If we have less spending for consumer goods and more spending for capital goods, if, in other words, General Motors sales revenues were to come less from the sale of passenger automobiles, more from the sale of diesel locomotives and heavy trucks, if the sales revenue of the construction industry were to come more from the builders of factories rather than the builders of homes and apartment buildings, if the sales revenues of the industries now producing washing machines and appliances and so forth were to come more heavily from purchases of machines to be used by business firms, well, how would this affect the utilization of our existing ability to produce? How would it affect the extent to which we concentrated on the production of capital goods versus the production of consumer goods? Wouldn't we concentrate more heavily on the production of capital goods? The extent to which business firms produce capital goods rather than consumer goods depends on the relative demands for them. Well, if we have a higher economic degree of capitalism, one major consequence will be that there will be a greater concentration on the production of capital goods. Now, how does this relate to the productivity of labor? Well, if we are producing more capital goods, then in the next period of time, the workers are now equipped with more and better capital goods. There will be more and better machinery per worker. So what does that do to the output per worker? It raises it. Now the productivity is higher. Now, this process can go on because consider, we now have an economic system which has produced more capital goods. Now it uses this larger supply of capital goods. Let us assume it uses this larger supply of capital goods, which gives it a larger total overall ability to produce, and it continues using it in this higher ratio in favor of capital goods. It's now going to permanently devote 35% of its effort to producing capital goods instead of 30%. Well, now we are producing with more capital goods. Our ability to produce both consumer goods and capital goods together has increased. Once we get the additional capital goods, if we use these additional capital goods just as heavily in proportionate terms to produce capital goods, we'll produce more capital goods than we did before. If we're devoting 35% of a larger productive base because we've already got some more capital goods, thanks to changing the ratio, if we devote 35% of our larger productive base to the production of capital goods, what will happen to the supply of capital goods in the next year? It'll be up again. Now, to keep the process going, we would need technological progress. If we stopped having further technological progress, the improvement in the ability to produce would start to peter out. But if we have a combination of a sufficiently high proportionate production of capital goods and technological progress, then from year to year we can have more capital goods per worker, and what will happen to the productivity of the average worker from year to year? It'll be going up. Well, the higher the economic degree of capitalism, the higher is wages relative to consumer spending, and the higher is the demand for capital goods relative to the demand for consumer goods. Thus, the more we concentrate on the production of capital goods, and thus the higher tends to be the productivity of labor from year to year. So this is the basic connection between the economic degree of capitalism and real wages. A higher economic degree of capitalism operates on both elements, on both factors determining real wages. A higher economic degree of capitalism means a larger wage share and, together with technological progress, a continuing rise in the productivity of labor. So real wages rise. Now there's one further closely related economic factor which I would like to mention, and then tie these deeper level economic factors to philosophical values. The ability to accumulate capital goods and raise the productivity of labor depends not just on the proportion of our effort that we devote to capital goods. It depends not just on the proportion of our effort that we devote to capital goods, but it also depends on the efficiency with which we produce capital goods. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose we had an isolated farmer, and he can represent the economy as a whole. The farmer's basic capital good is his seed. Now, what's the source of his seed? His crop. The farmer, in producing his crop, uses up seed, which he needs constantly to replenish out of his crop. Well, the economic system as a whole is constantly using up existing capital goods. When we make bread, we're using up flour. The bakery itself is wearing out, getting older. The steel mills are aging. Everything is aging, running down. If we want to replace the capital goods that we have and which are being used up or run down, what must be the source of replacement in physical terms? The production of the economy. Just as the farmer's crop is the source of his fresh seed, so if we want to replace the steel mills, cement factories, etc., the ultimate physical source is the production of the economic system. That's the only place. Now, we need to devote some proportion of our output to producing capital goods just for replacement. Just like the farmer, if he's going to have next year as much seed as he started with this year, he has to use some part of his crop to replace his seed. Otherwise, he'll end up with less seed. He won't be able to produce any crop. If we're going to replace the machines that are wearing out, the materials that are being used up, the factory buildings that are running down, there is some, call it maintenance proportion. We need to devote some proportion of the output of the economic system just to replace the capital goods being used up. And think of that proportion as the maintenance proportion. Now, we'll have capital accumulation if the proportion we devote to capital goods is greater than this maintenance proportion. If we need to devote 1/4 of our productive effort just to replace the capital goods we're using up, the maintenance proportion is 1/4. In order to produce more capital goods than we use up, we'd have to devote more than 1/4 to the production of capital goods. All right, but now let me show how the efficiency of the system is so vital here. Suppose we have a very inefficient farmer, and this is a farmer who for every bushel of seed is only able to produce 2 bushels of crop. He needs 1 bushel of seed to get 2 bushels of crop. All right, what is this farmer's maintenance proportion? Half, 50%. He needs to devote half of his output just to replace the capital goods that he's consuming. He would need to, if we translated him into a capitalist economy, if an economy were that inefficient, it would need to devote half of its output just to replace the capital goods it uses up. That would be to remain stationary. It wouldn't advance. Well, suppose our farmer could get to be more efficient, and now he found a way for each bushel of seed, instead of producing 2 bushels of crop, he could produce 4 bushels of crop. what happens to his maintenance ratio? Now it's only 25%. What will happen to his ability to accumulate capital if he was already willing to devote 50% of his output to production of seed, and now he'll stay at that high level, but his maintenance proportion has fallen? Now he can start accumulating capital. The more efficient an economic system is in its utilization of existing capital, the more output per unit of capital that an economic system can obtain, the lower is its maintenance proportion, and the more rapid can its capital accumulation be for any given higher proportion that it actually devotes to capital goods. An economy whose maintenance proportion is 25% and which devotes more than 25% to capital production will advance from year to year, and the productivity of its labor will be going up. A less efficient economy with a high maintenance proportion may decline, even devoting a higher proportionate production of capital goods. Let me give you a real-world illustration of this. What's the leading excuse of the Russians for why the standard of living, by their own admission, in Russia never seems to get much above that of 1913? What do they say they're doing that stops them? They're building heavy industry. Yeah. Now, they've been doing this since 1918. Now, you see, if there were any truth, you could say for 5 years, 10 years, maybe to build heavy industry cuts production of consumer goods. But once you've got some heavy industry, what should happen to your total productive ability to produce? It should be going up. And even if you're using a small proportion to produce consumer goods, if you have a rapidly growing productive base, pretty soon even a small proportionate production of consumer goods should far outstrip a larger proportionate production. Well, the actual fact is they don't accumulate capital. If we looked at the implications of what they're saying, if every year they're building heavy industry and the production of consumer goods is not increasing, the mathematics would imply that each year they keep using the whole increase in productive ability to build more heavy industry. It would imply a steadily rising ratio of concentration on capital goods. Long ago, they'd have been devoting 99 and 44/100% of their output just to capital goods, and Russia would be one factory from Leningrad to Vladivostok. But that's obviously not the case. The problem is they are so inefficient in their use of capital goods. They're supposed to be specialists in the art of constructing new old buildings, and they have hydroelectric stations without the generators and the tractors without the spare parts. They have to devote an incredible proportion of their activity just to stay even, and if they didn't have a world market to turn to, and if they didn't have foreign aid and loan guarantees and so forth, I would venture to say that the maintenance ratio of a socialist society is more than 100%. In other words, they cannot, you could start them off with the present capital equipment of the United States. That capital equipment runs down, ages, it constantly needs to be reproduced. The inefficiency of their system is so great, they could not reproduce the capital which they would be using up. And from year to year, they would have necessary capital decumulation and obviously a constantly falling productivity of labor. All right, well, let's keep in mind what we've got here in terms of economic principles underlying the rise in real wages. There is the economic degree of capitalism, which is determining wages relative to consumption and the share of the output of the economy which goes to capital goods relative to consumer goods, and which thus influences the productivity of labor. And there is the efficiency with which we produce capital goods, which determines our maintenance ratio, which together with the actual ratio of capital goods production determines whether we're going to accumulate capital or not, and how rapidly. The maintenance ratio says, for example, we need 25% of our output in capital goods to stand pat. Our actual concentration on capital goods, if that's more than 25%, we advance. Okay, now what we want to look at is what lies deeper than the economic degree of capitalism, deeper than the productivity with which we use capital goods. And here we come to the question of philosophical values. One major factor that's going to determine the economic degree of capitalism is the security of property. Why will people lay out money for the purpose of bringing in money in the future? They have to have the confidence that if they invest their money, it is not going to be seized from them by the government or Viking marauders or their neighbors or whatever. There has to be security of property, legal enforcement of contracts. Already you could make a major application to economic history. One of the leading, most beautiful features of Anglo-Saxon law is the prominence which it gave to the security of property. And it is no accident that the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain. The security of property that was established in Great Britain set the stage for a high economic degree of capitalism, which led the British already to be able to concentrate more heavily than any other country in the world on the production of capital goods. Now, in addition to the security of property, there is the extent of future orientation, which you could describe in more fundamental terms as rationality. The extent to which people are influenced by rationality will make them give present reality to their own personal future. In a society which is influenced by rationality, people will be thinking, well, what will happen to me in 10 years or 20 years? They will have a sense of self-responsibility. They'll regard themselves as causal agents. They will accept the fact that they have free will, that it's up to them to provide for their own future. Well, now, if we put together security of property, the sense of individual responsibility because the future has present reality and people recognize that they are self-responsible, well, what impact is this going to have on the economic degree of capitalism? It'll make it higher. Now, the efficiency with which we use the capital goods that we have, that depends on the tax situation. If profits are not taxed or minimally taxed, there are very, very powerful incentives to introduce improved methods of production. At the same time, economic freedom implies the absence of subsidies for inefficient methods. It implies the freedom of competition. Anybody who has a better way of doing things is legally allowed to do it in any line. If you put together powerful incentives to introduce improvements, to go and search them out, incentives to eliminate inefficient methods, well, what's going to be the effect of that on the efficiency with which capital goods are used? That will be greater. Well, economic freedom is deeper than the economic degree of capitalism, deeper than the efficiency with which we use capital goods. And as I say, rationality directly influences the economic degree of capitalism, and then rationality lies deeper than economic freedom. It's only when we come to regard the individual as capable of running his own life, and when we when we regard reason as man's distinguishing characteristic, which at the same time is potent, which leads us to value the individual human being. You see, it's only in degree that we value reason that we can value human beings and the human individual. And then if we say, here is the individual, he's fully capable of running his own life, and there is no creature in the world of more value than the human individual because he possesses reason, well, that's the foundation of individual rights and economic freedom. Well, that is as deep as I can take the source of the rise in real wages. All right, so this is the positive economic theory that I'm advancing, explaining what determines real wages. At the deepest level, it would be the cultural influence of the values of reason and freedom manifesting themselves in a sufficiently high economic degree of capitalism based on security of property, respect for individual rights, and all of the encouragements to improve the methods of production. And obviously, technological progress would be prominent in this, but that rests on the acceptance of causality, which rests on the acceptance of reason also. Okay. So that is the basic positive theory of real wages that I'm offering. And now, just as an elaboration of this to drive it home further, I want to point out the futility of anything but a rise in the productivity of labor as a source of higher real wages. This is now under the heading of G, the futility of anything but a rise in the productivity of labor as a cause of higher real wages. Specifically, the futility of attempting to force increases in nominal wages. Now, almost everybody's idea of how the standard of living improves is to go out and earn more money. That is true for an individual who operates in an environment of freedom of competition. If your thinking stops at the range of what you personally do, and all you're asking is, how can I, Joe Smith, raise my standard of living? The answer is, well, go and find a way to earn more money. That's perfectly true. But that answer is a very inadequate answer if we are asking what is required for everybody in the economic system to be able to raise his standard of living. If we want to know what makes it possible for the general standard of living to rise, the answer is much, much deeper than just go and earn more money. Usually people think, well, that's all there is to it. All we have to do, if we would like to raise the general standard of living, all we have to do is enable everybody to make more money. That's what the labor unions believe. That's what the government believes. Let's make it possible for everybody to earn more money. Well, I want to show that the standard of living cannot be raised by virtue of attempting to enable everybody to earn more money. The only thing which can raise the general standard of living is the rise in the productivity of labor and everything that underlies that rise. Let's consider the kinds of things necessary to raise the average money wage. What will do it? What does it take to raise the average money wage? And then we'll see if that, in fact, can raise the general standard of living. Well, how about more money? We increase the quantity of money. That will raise the average money wage. Will it raise the general standard of living? Not at all, because the extra money will also raise consumer prices. What would be another way of raising the amount of money that the average person who was employed could make? I'm sorry? No, I'm asking, what would be a way of raising the amount of money earned by the average worker employed? Well, we already looked at the money supply and we saw that would do it, but that's fewer workers. If there were fewer workers. Now, minimum wage laws and labor unions achieve the equivalent of fewer workers. They don't exterminate the workers, but they prevent them from working. They bring about the equivalent of fewer workers working. Well, now, if there are fewer workers working relative to the same payrolls, what happens to the money received by whoever continues to work? That goes up. All right, their money incomes are up. But what about real income? What about the ability to buy goods? That goes down, because now, for either way you look at it, if fewer people are working, what happens to production? That goes down. If the reduction is in proportion to the drop in employment, the rise in prices will be in proportion to the rise in wages. What about the burden of supporting the unemployed? That's there. All right, any attempt to raise money wages by virtue of creating more money or by reducing the supply of labor does not raise the general standard of living. At best, it would leave it unchanged, but in fact, it would worsen it. If we try pumping up the supply of money, we will have the problems of inflation, which undermine saving and capital formation, which I can't go into in this discussion, but I'll ask you to accept that as plausible. Inflation will actually operate to lower the productivity of labor. Preventing people from working will certainly reduce their real standard of living. So these two attempts to operate directly on money wages are in fact contrary to purpose. The attempt to raise the general level of money wages, whether through more money or less supply of labor, is futile. It won't raise real wages, it'll end up lowering them. Well, let's consider further, is there any way that we could raise the demand for labor without increasing the quantity of money? How could it be possible for the demand for labor to go up without increasing the quantity of money? And let me rule out a higher velocity of circulation, because that's essentially the same, of the same character as more money. Everything we've just said about more money would apply to a higher velocity of circulation. So think for a moment. If we have the same quantity of money in the economic system, the same overall rate of spending of money, where could the money come from to make possible an increase in total payrolls? What are possible sources? All right, how about less spending for capital goods? Suppose business firms reduce their expenditure for materials, for plant and equipment, and use the funds to pay greater payrolls. You could visualize that again in terms of Table 7. Imagine that instead of spending to buy capital goods being 300 and wage payments being 500, spending to buy capital goods falls to 200 and wage payments rise to 600. All right, here would be a source of greater demand for labor. It wouldn't be the result of inflation. But what would be the consequence? Well, the workers would now be able to spend 600 instead of 500. All right, what's happened to the demand for consumer goods? That's gone up. If the supply of consumer goods stayed the same, already we know that there has to be a substantial rise in prices, which already wipes out most of the rise in wages. What would be the effect of less spending for capital goods on the proportionate production of capital goods and thus on the productivity of labor? That would go down. Well, the effect of this would be that while money wages would rise, prices would end up rising more than money wages. Now, a further way to see it is, think of the fact that every single price can be expressed, as I explained yesterday in answer to a question, every price is equal to a sum of profits and wage payments. The price of an automobile is equal to the profit of the auto producers, the profit of the steel producers who made the steel sheet, on, plus the wages of the auto workers, the wages of the steel workers, the wages of the iron miners, etc. Now, if wages rise because there's less spending for capital goods, if the rate of profit stays the same, what is implied about the price of goods? If all that happened was wages rose, but the rate of profit is the same, and the price of everything is in effect equal to a series of wage payments times a rate of profit, which is being compounded, if we increase wages in any given ratio, what's implied about prices? Increase to the same extent. If you think of prices as equal to wages times 1 plus a rate of profit to some power reflecting the period of time, well, any rise in wages implies an equivalent rise in prices. But if at the same time the productivity of labor falls, if there's less output per worker, what's happening to labor cost per unit? That's going up. If we were paying $100 of wages to produce a product, and now we're paying 110 and the price is proportionately higher, and at the same time that worker only produces half a unit instead of a whole unit, well, the price is going to be doubled. There'll be a rise in wages, but the rise in prices will outstrip the rise in wages. All right, so observe, a rise in demand for labor coming at the expense of the demand for capital goods does not improve the standard of living of the average worker. The increase in the quantity of money, a rise in the velocity of circulation, even now a rise in demand for labor without inflation does not raise the general standard of living. There is only one very limited source by which a rise in the demand for labor is capable of raising wages, real wages. And that would be to the extent that the owners and creditors of business firms, those who sell products, to the extent that they would reduce their personal consumption expenditure and use the funds to pay higher wages, to that extent, there's a higher demand for labor. There is no greater demand for consumer goods. There would be a rise in real wages. That's what we were working with in the distribution factor. To the extent that those who sell products used less of the proceeds for their own consumption, more of the sales proceeds to pay wages, well, to that extent, a rise in the demand for labor could raise real wages. But that's it. And I hasten to point out, A, that magnitude is extremely limited. There's very little potential there. And more importantly, B, it can never be violently seized. What is required to achieve a higher economic degree of capitalism? What conditions have to exist? Are businessmen going to plow back their funds and save if they're in danger of being expropriated, or if the opposite prevails? If the opposite. Now, suppose you're a humanitarian and you would like to see the highest possible ratio of wage payments to consumption spending. What would be required to achieve that? What sort of political atmosphere would have to prevail in order to have the highest possible economic degree of capitalism, including the highest possible ratio of wage payments to consumption? Laissez-faire, full respect for property rights, the absence of efforts at redistributionism. The more the redistributors attempt to go at it, the opposite is the result. They are working to destroy capital formation. Like you could see it going on in the newspapers today. The leftist guerrillas in El Salvador want to expropriate the capitalists. What is the effect of that on the demand for labor in El Salvador? It's getting wiped out, because who wants to invest in El Salvador when you can be expropriated by the communist guerrillas? If the communist guerrillas there had as a genuine goal improvement in the conditions of the workers, the first thing they would do is stop their activities and try to achieve a peaceful state of affairs through the countryside. All right, well, this, let me point out there is one temporarily potent way, more potent way, in which a rise in demand for labor might operate to the benefit of the wage earners. Suppose we could abolish the corporate income tax and the progressive personal income tax and the inheritance tax. Imagine we could reduce government spending sharply enough to make possible the abolition of the corporate and progressive personal income tax and the inheritance tax. Now, at present, a huge amount of funds is being paid in to pay these taxes. Corporations are paying in maybe 35% or whatever of their profits to pay the corporate income tax. Individuals are paying huge chunks of taxes and the inheritance tax, on and on. Now, if these taxes did not exist, what would be done with a major chunk of the money presently used to pay these taxes? They would be productively expended. They would operate to raise the M relative to M prime. Much of the funds presently used to pay these taxes would enlarge the demand for labor. Another portion would enlarge the demand for capital goods. Well, what would happen is we'd have a sharp and progressing improvement in real wages. Wages relative to consumption would go up. Capital goods production relative to consumer goods production would go up. The productivity of labor would rise. But observe, even here, the long-run major benefit would be from the rise in the productivity of labor. The rise in demand for labor would be of a one-shot nature. The government takes less, the wage earners get some more, that's the end of it. The permanent improvement would be that we'd have a higher proportionate production of capital goods, and from year to year, the productivity of labor would rise. All right, now, as I say, redistributionism is a self-destructive policy. If the redistributors are aiming to redistribute the capital, and this is I went into in the seminar I gave in New York, Toronto, and Los Angeles, and also 2 years ago, if the redistributors are out to redistribute the capital, which is what they usually appear to do, you know, like the Symbionese Liberation Army wants Hearst to take his money to feed the masses in San Francisco. Well, their idea is here's Hearst with his millions, and here are the people who are hungry. Take his wealth and consume it. Well, that's outright immediate destruction. You're eating the seed corn. Now, if the redistributors don't want to actually decumulate the capital, the only thing that is left as the maximum potential that they could eye would be the personal consumption expenditure of the capitalists. Not the profit or interest, whatever part of the profit or interest the capitalists have that they save and invest, that's going back into capital goods and into wage payments. The only thing that the redistributors could hope to achieve, quote, rationally, unquote, would be what the capitalists personally consume. A, that's not very significant. B, the attempt to get it destroys the motive to accumulate capital and to maintain production. So things would degenerate into chaos. Redistributionism, at its best, destroys the motives to accumulate capital and maintain capital. At its worst, it's a direct, immediate plundering of capital. All right, now, let us keep all of this in mind. I've presented in the course of 2 lectures. I suppose I should stop in a minute or two, which I'll make myself do. What I presented is a positive theory of the determination of real wages. And I hope you can keep all this in mind, hold it as one unit. Now, starting tomorrow, we're going to approach the interpretation of economic history armed with this theory of wages. You see, the economic historians are not just looking at the facts. No history book just says, in 1812, Joe Smith worked 98 hours and got 3 loaves of bread. They don't stop there. In any history book, there is, at least by implication, a whole economic theory. History, certainly economic history, is written from the perspective of a definite economic theory, and the economic theory which has permeated all of the history books has been the Marxist economic theory. And now we have an opposing economic theory, and we're going to look at the same basic historical facts, like the standard of living was miserably low. People were working terribly long hours. Children were working. The conditions of work were miserable. Those are all facts. But now we're going to give a very, very different explanation of why those were the facts and what changed the facts. And we'll see that it will be 100% opposite than what we usually take for granted. So thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Valiant.
Every time on the rare occasion they float the idea of abolishing the corporate income tax or capital gains taxes, you hear a huge scream of, from the left. And from your lecture, those seem to be some of the key targets of holding wages down. I'm just curious at this paradox, what kind of economic theory is behind the resistance to abolishing those kind of taxes?
All right, what is the economic theory underlying the resistance to abolishing the corporate income tax, the capital gains tax, etc.? It's the Marxist doctrine. The capitalists are exploiting the workers. That is one major aspect of it. And the other is sheer simple ignorance, not understanding the nature of the operation of private property in a division of labor society. People believe that the only beneficiaries of private property in any form, including in the form of capital, are the owners. So their idea is, well, the only one who would benefit from General Motors having a higher income is the stockholders of General Motors. They're forgetting the fact that the factories of General Motors are producing automobiles that everybody buys. If General Motors had more physical wealth, there'd be more automobiles and better automobiles available. And if it had more wealth, there'd be more demand for labor. You see, they're forgetting the fact that in a division of labor economy, the wealth of other people, when it's used for business purposes, is the source of the supply of the things you buy and of the demand for the things you sell. And they're looking at it as though we still had feudalism, where the only one who benefits from a piece of property is the owner. So I'm sure there are other factors too. Even if they knew all this, they might not want it. Yes, in the far rear.
What do you think of President Reagan's proposed tax plan?
What do I think of President Reagan's proposed tax plan? I have mixed views on it. The attempt to limit the top tax rate to 35%, I think, is very good and philosophically important, because it's tending to establish the principle that he who earns the income at least has the right to more than half of it. So, so from that point of view, it's a step in the right direction. It should be pointed out, though, people shouldn't think, well, boy, it's really going to be great, only 35%, because there's first a corporate income tax, which he's projecting to limit, I think, to 33%. Imagine you own a corporation and the new tax laws go into effect. Your corporation makes $1 of profit, you pay 33 cents corporate tax, then you have 67 cents left, out of which you have to pay another 35%, which is roughly about, 24 cents or something. So you're down to 43 cents. And then we haven't even allowed for the state and local vultures to get to you. So it wouldn't be all that good even if enacted. But more seriously, there's some fatal weaknesses in the tax plan. You see, if the tax proposal really reduced the tax burden that lands on savings, if business taxes were truly cut, if taxes of people in the upper brackets were truly cut, and everybody else's taxes cut or at least not increased, then the plan would have real merit. But this is an attempt to rearrange how the taxes are collected. The goal of the program is to leave total tax collections basically the same. And one basic method of achieving this is that business tax credits will be abolished and accelerated depreciation will be abolished or restricted. Without going into any detail as to precisely what those things are, the effect would be that even though corporations would pay a lower maximum tax rate, instead of a maximum tax rate of 46%, they'd pay 33%. When you take away the loss of the credits and the accelerated depreciation, their actual tax burden would be significantly larger than it is now. Well, that would mean the actual effect of the program would be to reduce the demand for capital goods and the demand for labor. So I would be against it. The proper principle of tax reform, I believe, is that nobody's taxes should be increased. We should only be talking about reducing government spending and reducing taxes. Then, if you get the tax rates down low enough, if, for example, we abolish the corporate income tax, then the issue of tax credits, accelerated depreciation, it's all meaningless. No, you can depreciate whatever you like. Now, I think, we'd like to know how could we ever turn things around. If we wanted to have a political movement that could eventually change the direction in which we're moving, I think one very vital principle to try to establish, a minimal principle, which would be just the first step, is a freeze on real per capita non-defense spending. We should adopt as a principle, whatever the government programs may now be, total government spending on a per capita basis in real terms should not be allowed to increase. That is the minimum. And of course, we'd actually want to get some decrease in there, but if we simply had the principle that the government is frozen as a minimum to where it is now on a per capita basis, and we could at the same time begin to achieve some economic progress. Suppose we could achieve an improvement, economic progress at the rate of 2% a year. So the average real income goes up 2% a year, but the government's take is frozen. Well, then in 35 years, there would be a revolutionary change in the relative size of government. The relative size of government would be cut in half just by virtue of economic progress. And of course, in those 35 years, we should be working to reduce the size of government further. But a very major thing could be accomplished just by freezing the government and making it possible for economic progress to exist at some rate, even if it's just 2% a year. So it'd be a vital principle. We can't have a total revolution overnight, but if we could establish this as a principle and get this adopted, that alone would achieve enormous good as time went on. Yes?
You had the gold standard. What would it solve immediately, and wouldn't it solve the tax problems immediately, or?
What would a gold standard solve immediately? Well, we'd have to really spend time talking about what kind of gold standard, but let's say we had a proper gold standard. A gold standard of the right kind would compel the government to operate with a balanced budget. You see, suppose the money of the country were not these bits of paper that the government can create as it wishes, but suppose the basic money of the country were circulating gold coin. Or at least that's a major chunk of the actual money supply. And now the government needs money. The congressmen are up there saying, well, we've got to have this new hospital built and the food program and the education and so on. But now they have a problem. The money is gold and they need gold, and they can't manufacture it themselves. So where must they turn for the gold? They must turn to the citizens. Now, they can turn in the form of getting taxes, or they could try to borrow gold. But if you're borrowing gold and what you have to repay is gold, well, where will you get the gold to repay? Well, you'll go bankrupt if you start owing too much and you can't get the gold. You see, with gold as money, the government would face a real threat of bankruptcy if it pursued a policy of deficits. Now, unless the government is run by the New York City Council, it will be responsible enough not to want to go bankrupt. So then the government would say, well, look, we must take in taxes each year what we're spending. Because if they don't do that, on a gold standard, they'll go bankrupt. With a gold standard, they're compelled to operate with a balanced budget. Then that changes the whole the whole environment in which the government operates. Because then, anytime somebody has a proposal for some new government program, they've just got to go find the money. They can't be talking out in the sky, wouldn't we like to have this program? They're compelled to find the money. And then anyone who's like Hubert Humphrey, who would always be talking about we need this or that and look at the disadvantaged and the poor and wouldn't it be nice to spend for them, he would be obliged in the very same session of Congress to explain where the money was to come from. So government programs would be recognized as having a cost. Now today, for years, they haven't been recognized as having a cost. The government doesn't have to get the money from the people, it can print it. And the government is perceived simply as providing wonderful programs. No necessary connection to cost is seen. And so the political debate has been carried on for decades. Here are the nice humanitarian liberals who want to just do things for us. And here are these inexplicably mean, nasty individuals who are imposing good things for the people for no reason. Well, with a gold standard and the necessity of balanced budgets, that alone would trim the size of government. And if we had had the gold standard, we wouldn't have had the growth in government. Mr. Griffell.
You were talking about taking the consumption of the wealthy and redistributing it to the poor. You pointed out that would remove motivation.
Yeah.
You did point out that the wealthy buy things like Rolls Royces, which are made of things, which are made by people who have jobs.
Right.
What you're really doing is taking that money away from the whole chain of the economy that produces those luxury objects and giving it to the poor. You're not just taking it from the wealthy person.
All right, the question is, if you were to if the government were somehow to reduce the consumption of wealthy people.
That isn't the question.
Oh.
You talked about the Hearst and the SLA.
Yeah.
They could take his consumption, or they took his savings, they didn't do anything. The savings was capital, but his personal consumption they could take. Say he buys a Rolls-Royce automobile.
Yeah.
You didn't point out that that Rolls-Royce automobile is manufactured, and all its components are manufactured. So they're really taking away that demand for that whole chain that produces the Rolls-Royce, and they're giving it to the poor. So they're taking it from a lot of people to give it to a lot of people.
All right, Mr. Griffell is saying that if there is some government confiscation of luxury expenditure, they are not simply taking it from the spenders, but from all those who produce for the spenders. Well, in a sense that is true, but that would not represent any net reduction in employment or capital, because, let us say, a wealthy individual doesn't buy the Rolls Royce. And now, let's say 100 poorer people buy a little bicycle. All right, less labor would be employed to produce the Rolls Royce, less capital would be used to produce the Rolls Royce, but there would be just as much additional employment to produce the bicycles. Yeah.
But the presumption is on average that wealthier people are smarter than poorer people and are making better decisions with their money.
Yeah.
So by redistributing it to poorer people, on average, you're debilitating the whole economy.
Well, you'd be debilitating the whole economy, but not by virtue of employment and capital depending on consumption. You see, I think you're implicit in what you're saying is that you need luxury consumption to provide employment. That's what I pick up in your question. I may be mistaken, but that seems implicit in the question.
The central point of the question was simply that if a politician says, I'm taking a Rolls Royce from one person to give food to 500 people, he's misleading you, because behind that Rolls Royce is a lot of jobs and food for a lot of other people. So he's taking from a group to give to a group.
Okay, but you see, he's taking the Rolls Royce from the wealthy person, and behind the Rolls Royce are jobs and capital and food for all the producers of the Rolls Royce. But then behind the goods that the poorer people would get are also jobs and capital goods. So the jobs and the capital goods behind the goods are the same on both sides.
I guess my point is the efficiency of the use of the money being used by smarter people is what's being degraded.
Well, the way that is there is if you take away the Rolls Royce from the man who's intelligent enough to earn that, what you'll be doing is taking away his motivation, let's say, to operate a shoe factory or whatever, and the harm will come not because he's consuming less directly, but because now he'll be motivated not to produce. You see, sometimes in a different form this question comes up. People say, well, how is it that saving is necessary for capital formation? Why isn't consumption? They say, suppose a wealthy person buys a yacht. Well, there's the employment and the capital goods to produce the yacht. Now, if instead of buying the yacht, he's buying a freighter, there's the employment and the capital goods to produce the freighter. Well, what is significantly different here? What's significantly different is the freighter contributes to further production, the yacht doesn't. That's the significant difference. The gentleman right here, yeah.
What has happened to real wages over the last, let's say, 20, 30 years?
What's happened to real wages over the last 20 or 30 years? Until about 1970, it seems that real wages were continuing to increase. From 1970 down to at least the early 80s, it appeared either that they were stagnant or possibly declining. You can have varying interpretations. In the last year or two, it seems that there's some tendency to rise, but the whole thing would be arguable. What is certainly the case is that over the course of, let us say, the 200-year period from 1785 down to, let us say, 1965, virtually year by year, certainly decade by decade, there was a noticeable rise in real wages. Yeah.
I think you said that technological progress is required for a continuing increase in real wages.
Right.
I understand capital's contribution to an increase in real wages, but I don't understand why technological progress is required. I understand that it would increase, but I don't understand why it is necessary.
All right, why is technological progress necessary for the rise in real wages? I would say technological progress is necessary for the continued accumulation of capital goods. You see, suppose the technology of railroading had never been discovered, and the technology of making modern steel mills and so forth. All right, what effect would that have had on our ability to accumulate capital? Could we, for example, by virtue of a high degree of saving alone, have ever developed the productive capacity where we could have produced all of the steel rail that we happen to put into the railroads without the technology of railroading existing, without the technology of steel making existing? You see, there's a popular economic doctrine propounded in this country by Alvin Hansen in the 1930s known as secular stagnationism. And he was the major American popularizer of Keynes and the teacher of Paul Samuelson. And his argument was the reason that we had such a terrible depression was that people were saving excessively, we were accumulating a lot of capital, and technological progress was not coming along in sufficient volume to use the capital being generated by saving. And at the same time, we were lucky in previous generations, back in the 19th century, because then we had the technology of railroad building and canal building, which absorbed a lot of capital. So we didn't have this problem. Well, the reality is that technological progress is indispensable for capital accumulation. If we had an economy with no railroads, how would that affect our ability to build railroads? Could we build railroads the way we do without railroads? Could we construct steel mills as we do if we had no steel mills? No, you see, it would not be possible in the absence of all of the capital goods that we have, in the absence of the technology which they represent, to produce the capital goods that we've got. You see, it could never be the case that somehow through saving in a sailboat economy, if we had an economy whose technology was limited to sailing vessels and ox carts, there would be no conceivable way that we could have the ability to cut the ties and produce the rails to lay 200,000 miles of rail, only unfortunately there are no railroads to use all this. See, it just couldn't be that we'd have 200,000 miles of steel rail stacked up in a yard somewhere and all the railroad ties and the parts to make the locomotives, only nobody has thought of railroads to put this stuff to use. You see, we just couldn't have it without the technology. Now, the way it works is we started out, we built a few primitive railroads in the 1830s, let's say. Now we had some railroads. Given the existence of those railroads, what was the effect on our subsequent ability to build further railroads? It was easier to build some more railroads once you have some. And once we had some steel mills of the 1830s, that made it easier to build steel mills of the 1840s. Well, at each step, technological progress contributes to our subsequent ability to produce, including the ability to produce capital goods. If we took away technological progress, in what form would our greater wealth consist? Where would we have greater wealth? Suppose we only had the same kind of goods today that were in existence in 1785. Well, what would the workers be producing?
More sailboats and more ox carts.
Well, you say more sailboats and more ox carts only in a very, very limited amount. Suppose we have capital accumulation could mean a teamster drives a bigger ox cart. Okay, now he does that. But if we're carrying on production with a few extra bigger ox carts, is that going to be able to increase subsequent production as much as if we start substituting for the ox carts some railroads?
Not as much, but there would be some improvement, presumably, in real wages if there were more ox carts.
There would be some, but you see, as we increase the capital per worker, if we had a constant state of technology, we could have some capital accumulation, but then we would run into diminishing returns to the extra capital goods. We'd have some extra capital goods, we could produce some more, but not that much more. Then we'd have a lesser increase in capital goods, we could produce a little bit more, the thing would peter out. Technological progress makes it possible to have constant returns to capital, so that as we increase the supply of capital goods, we can go on increasing our ability to produce more or less proportionately. That's the contribution of technological progress to capital accumulation. Mr. Schwartz.
You said that you can't increase the average real wage by governments restricting the supply of labor, because as the supply of labor goes down proportionally, production will go down and prices will go up.
Right, and there's the burden of supporting the unemployed.
Now, but why do you assume that it would be proportionate? Wouldn't, say you restrict the labor supply by 10%, wouldn't the drop in production be, let's say, 5% because you're reducing the laborers on the margin, and they would be less productive than the workers who are left?
All right, that's possible that the initial effect, if the unemployment put out of use just the oldest, poorest machines, the drop in production might be less than proportionate to the drop in employment. That's true. But then you still have to add in the burden of supporting the unemployed. Then we have to look at a somewhat longer run picture, and that is, in the long run, what is the effect of more people being able to work rather than less people? In the longer run, if we have an economy in which more people can be employed, what is the effect on the extent of the division of labor? We'll have a greater division of labor, right? All right, and a greater division of labor means that we will have a higher output per worker. In the long run, a larger number of people cooperating in the division of labor tends to mean a higher productivity of labor. And this is a major issue that I went into 2 summers ago. And if we had, on a deeper level, if we have a society embracing a larger number of people, and we would have, let's say, double the number of engineers. If we have an economy twice the size, then it means double the number of engineers, double the number of people who are in whatever fields are involved in unearthing new knowledge and implementing it. What will be the effect of that on the productivity of labor? If we have twice the people looking for an improvement in auto transmissions, twice the people looking how to do brain surgery better, there's an increased likelihood of success. The effect of a larger division of labor will be a more rapid rate of technological progress. Over here in the white jacket.
It sounds like you're not going to get to the last section of the handout. Would you recommend some reading related to that?
Reading related to the theory of profit. All right. What I could recommend is Bombaverk's 3-volume work, Capital and Interest, the material in Human Action on Interest, and anything on capital in human action. And I would recommend the writings of the classical economists. And putting aside modesty, I would recommend my own doctoral dissertation, which unfortunately is a very cut-down version. It's referenced on the last page of the handout. It's available from University Microfilms. Yeah?
On the first chalkboard there, you've got money exchange for commodity, or money capital.
No, money exchanging for commodities.
Right. On the top part there, capitalist he's saved up some money and puts together a commodity and then sells it again for profit.
Right.
And then below that, you've got somebody who creates commodities directly, exchanges it for money and another commodity. Is that correct?
No, below that, what I'm showing is that the alleged simple circulation or pre-capitalist circulation, CMC, can be thought of as having an implied first term of m equal to 0. So I'm saying that what Marx called pre-capitalist circulation represents 0 economic degree of capitalism. The first m is not present.
So there's no profit involved in the second part?
You say there's no profit involved in the second part. On the contrary, I would say that in pre-capitalist circulation, everything is profit. That is a fatal error of Adam Smith and Marx. See, Marx got this sequence of CMC straight out of Adam Smith. Smith said, in an early and rude state of affairs, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer. He has neither employer or landlord to share with him. All income is wages. Now, in reality, if we had, like to allude to Professor Walsh's lecture yesterday, that potter who's producing pots all by himself, and he's turning around and using the sales proceeds to buy shoes or food. All right, he has sales revenue. The purchase of a pot is not the payment of a wage. The purchase of a pot or a pair of shoes or a loaf of bread is the purchase of a product. It constitutes sales revenue. Now, if that seller has not spent any money for the purpose of producing that pot, if he's just selling the pot, what are his money costs of production? 0. He has 0 costs. The whole proceeds are profit. Now, when the capitalist emerges and starts to spend money for the purpose of bringing in money, that's when wages emerge. You see, it's not the case that first everything is wages and then along comes the capitalist and subtracts profit from wages. It's the reverse. First, everything is sales revenue, all of which is profit. Then the capitalists come along. They create productive expenditure, part of which is wages, part of which is demand for capital goods. And that gives rise to cost of production, which reduces profit as a percentage of sales revenue. In the pre-capitalist economy, profit is 100% of sales revenue. There are no wages. It's only the rise of capitalists that make possible the existence of wage earners. And the more economically capitalistic the economy is, the higher are wages relative to profits. Yes?
Is the economic degree of capitalism the same as profit?
Pardon me?
Is the economic degree of capitalism, the ratio of M prime N, is it the same as the profit rate?
Is the economic degree of capitalism the same as the profit rate? I would say it's related inversely. The higher the economic degree of capitalism, the higher is M relative to M prime, the lower will profit be relative to M prime. See, the higher is the spending to buy the factors of production relative to the sales revenues, the lower will be profit relative to the sales revenues. Now, I can anticipate questions. Does this mean that under full capitalism there's hardly anything left for profit? Well, the rate of profit is less, but there are other factors. You see, a higher economic degree of capitalism has what effect on the rate of economic progress? It increases it. Now, there are other determinants of the rate of profit, and if you look at the opening discussion, one factor determining the nominal rate of profit is the rate of increase in the quantity of money. If we have an economic system which progresses more rapidly, one spillover effect will be a somewhat higher increase in the quantity of money, and that will operate to add something to the nominal rate of profit. But that starts taking us into the profit discussion. I think I can take just one more. The gentleman right here, yes. Behind you.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
To what extent do you believe that deductions and credits, tax credits, and so on interfere with or mitigate the effects of the tax on corporations?
To what effect do tax credits and presumably accelerated depreciation mitigate the effect of the tax rates on corporations? Well, if you read the statistics, the tax rate on corporations goes to 46%, and you can be in that bracket fairly quickly. I think if you make over $100,000 even, you're in that bracket. Now, the statisticians say that corporations have been paying an actual amount of tax equal to 25% of their profits. That's what I recall. But that can be misleading because to the extent that we have inflation, profits are systematically overstated. The creation of new and additional money raises sales revenue. That will enlarge profits because your costs have been laid out in the past. And when it comes time to replace your assets, you'll have to do so at higher prices. So the actual real effective rate of taxation on corporations is certainly higher than the statisticians are reporting. And a few years ago, when inflation was a more powerful factor, the effective rate of tax on corporations may have been up at 70, 80% or more. Inflation wipes out the ability to accumulate capital because it creates income, it creates seeming profits, most of which are needed to replace assets at higher prices, but on which you're paying regular tax rates. Well, I think we'll be evicted if we don't stop, so thank you very much.